Liz, you're ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Okay, so let's get started. So first, I'd like to introduce our new seminar coordinators, Nicole Maroon and Coral Moreno. They'll be taking over for Annie and I in the coming weeks, so please welcome them, and you'll soon be getting all the emails from them. So our speakers this afternoon, we have Dr. Larry Mayer, the director for the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping, Dr. Brian Calder, who is the center's associate director, and Liz Weidner, who will be given the presentation, who is a jointly appointed Ph.D. student in oceanography at both UNH and Stockholm University. We ask that you hold your questions till the end this week, so I'll hand it over to you, Liz.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. As Alyssa said, my name is Elizabeth Reed Weidner, and I'm joined by Dr. Mayer and Dr. Calder. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Mapping on Top of the World, the Ryder 2019 expedition. So this was a multidisciplinary scientific research cruise in Northern Greenland on the Swedish Icebreaker Oden. And as you can see on the right-hand slide, this was really a group effort of many universities and government organizations from a number of countries with the really excellent support of Oden's crew, who facilitated some really amazing science. So the primary goal of this expedition was really the investigation of the history and the dynamics of the Greenland ice sheets, and specifically that of Ryder Glacier. So in the left-hand image, you can see the Greenland ice sheet, and it's colored by accumulation change over approximately 1 year. You can see, especially in Western and Northern Greenland, we have significant mass loss. And this is part of a larger trend illustrated in this figure, where we have year and then the mass balance. And you can see since the 90s, in the past 30 years, there's been this accelerated melting of the Greenland ice sheet. And so as part of our overall goal, we're primarily interested in studying the patterns and the causes of this very relatively sudden dynamic change in the Greenland cryosphere, which has very real world consequences. The total melting of the Greenland ice sheet represents more than 7 meters of sea level rise. And then within these broader objectives, we're particularly interested in the role of the floating ice shelves, or the ice tongues, in the evolution of Greenland's glaciers. And for those of you who maybe don't work in the cryosphere, a floating ice tongue is an extension of a glacier past its termination point. As the name suggests, it floats in the seawater, and you can see an image of one here. And these ice shelves, they have a buttressing effect on ice flow. They can reduce mass loss. Greenland is losing its floating ice tongues. There are only 2 remaining in Northern Greenland. One is at Ryder Glacier, which is the subject of this expedition, and the other is Petermann Glacier, which was part of an earlier expedition in 2015. Now, Greenland used to have more floating ice shelves. The green dot in this image, so this is Northern Greenland, and each of these green dots indicate an outlet glacier. The shapes indicate the type of glacier. So the stars are those glaciers that have floating ice tongues, and we can see Petermann and Ryder have floating ice tongues. There are a few in the east with names I'm not going to try to pronounce, but you'll also see a number of circles and squares. And these are glaciers which have had ice tongues in the past, and in many cases, those are recent losses. So Greenland is rapidly losing its floating ice tongues, and most of those that still exist, like Petermann, are retreating quite rapidly, which brings us to Ryder and its particularly interesting dynamics. So Ryder Glacier, we see here in Sherard Osborn Fjord, unlike the rest of Greenland's floating ice tongues, and actually the majority of the floating ice tongues in the Northern Hemisphere, is actually advancing 43 meters per year for approximately the last 70 years. And as you can imagine, we're quite keen to study this system given its advancements. What is it about the geology of Sherard Osborn Fjord, the oceanography of the area, that allows for expansion in a time where we elsewhere have retreat and loss? Now, it's easy to say that we'd like to study Ryder Glacier. It's much harder to do. Northern Greenland, which we see in this image here, is one of the most isolated regions of the world. So this is Thule Air Force Base, far above the Arctic Circle, Nares Strait, and this is the position of the Petermann Glacier from the 2015 expedition, and farther north, emptying into the Lincoln Sea in this P1 box is Sherard Osborn Fjord and Ryder Glacier. And Lincoln Sea, if you don't know, is kind of the last bastion of multi-year sea ice, and it's physically pretty impassable for most of the year. In fact, not really most of the year. In fact, Sherard Osborn Fjord has no bathymetric information prior to this expedition. It's completely uncharted in modern times. You can see some depth measurements in the Lincoln Sea. These were taken by helicopter drilling activities, but we don't have any information about Sherard Osborn Fjord. And so we have lots of questions, some of them very basic. Does this fjord have a sill? Can we establish the retreat dynamics of Ryder Glacier by looking at its bathymetry and understand its history so that we may understand what it might do in the future? Can we even get here? Is that even possible? As I mentioned, the ice conditions here are very challenging. So these are a couple of satellite imagery, 2015, 2017. This is Sherard Osborn Fjord, and we can see just how socked in it is with sea ice. So even an icebreaker would find it's quite difficult to get into this area. But as you might know, the sea ice pack in the Arctic is shrinking very rapidly due to warming climate. And so if we look at this series of images, and I'm hoping these show up for you, we can see the multi-year ice pack has broken away from Northern Greenland. This is the summer of 2018. And if we watch to the end, we see it break away from the entrance of Sherard Osborn Fjord as well, which means there's potential for a ship to make it through Nares Strait into the Lincoln Sea, enter this fjord, and study Ryder Glacier. So with this goal in mind, the Ryder expedition was planned. It was complete with a backup plan just in case these conditions didn't manifest in 2019. They did. So the scientific team and a few of the crew members met in New York at Newburgh Air Force Base. We got onto this C-17 cargo plane. You can see us all there in the cargo hold. We flew into Thule Air Force Base, we boarded Oden, and we started steaming north. And we made excellent time. From Thule to this P4 box only took us 3 days, and that included a number of stations as well, oceanographic stations. We collected some data. For comparison, it took twice that amount of time in 2015 to get to Petermann Glacier, which is farther south. So we had really manageable ice conditions. Now, we did, in fact, encounter multi-year sea ice in the Lincoln Sea, about 55 nautical miles of it between where we started and the entrance to Sherard Osborn Fjord. It took us about 3 days. It was very loud. The ship vibrated very heavily. If you've never been on an icebreaker breaking ice, there's just a lot of vibration, and sometimes the ship will jolt very rapidly to the side, and then you will absolutely spill your coffee on yourself and it will hurt. We use helicopters to multiple times a day to map out sort of our path through the ice. And we also use data from the US National Ice Center. They provided us at least daily satellite images. So this is the entrance to Sherard Osborn Fjord. This is our current position, I guess, on the 10th of August. And if we zoom in to this imagery, we see our track plotted in Larry's GIS software. This is the track, I think, of the helicopter, and this is Oden's current position. And you can see in the satellite data, Oden's track. So this white line, this is us breaking, this was our track breaking through the ice here. And if we zoom in just a little bit closer and we turn off the yellow dot, we can actually see Oden in the satellite data. So it's about 12 pixels in the satellite data. And for reference, this is what it looks like from a helicopter. So we see Oden, we see multi-year sea ice here. You can kind of tell because it's a little bit dirty. But we also see not open water, but pathways through the ice. And these were the kind of pathways that we followed to make it to Sherard Osborn Fjord. Once we arrived, we found relatively ice-free, a couple of very large icebergs sort of floating around. So here you can see the floating ice tongue of Ryder Glacier. That extends backwards about, I think, 23 kilometers to its grounding point, and then up onto terrestrial Greenland. The fjord itself is over 17 kilometers across, and from the ice tongue to the mouth is something like 55 kilometers. And I know I'm throwing numbers at you, but it's very hard to impress upon you the scale of this place. So this is a panorama. It's taken from the eastern fjord wall. So we're looking sort of down on the ice tongue here. This is actually a piece of the ice tongue that had since broken off. It's over 10 kilometers long. And Oden's in this picture, way over there. That's Oden, 120 meters long, 6 stories tall, within this really massive landscape. And I got to tell you, being on Oden, even being on the bridge 6 stories up, it was very hard to process the magnitude of some of these features. You could be sort of approaching the ice tongue on Oden from, you know, several kilometers away, and it would only seem like it was a few meters high. And as you got closer and closer, it would grow until suddenly you were looking at the ice tongue and you realized it was nearly at your eye level, you know, 6 stories up. So it's just really impressive and beautiful. And I feel very privileged to have been able to go on this cruise. So onto the science. What did we do? What did we collect? So this is a overview image of the huge amount of data that we collected, all of the locations, the sites, the stations of data collection. Everything is underlain with bathymetric imagery because this was a mapping cruise. We were mapping 24 hours a day. Sherard Osborn Fjord and Ryder Glacier were our sort of primary location of focus, but we also collected data in the Lincoln Sea, Robson's Canal, and also Petermann Fjord. We made such good time up there, you know, 3 days to the entrance of Lincoln Sea that we had time to go back and like do a mini cruise in Petermann Fjord to supplement data collected in 2015. There were 14 work packages. You can see them here. I'm gonna walk through each of them. They all had their own PI, principal investigator, team of scientists working on them. And I'll start talking about those ones that were collected from Oden directly. So either from deployed equipment from the A-frames or from a system mounted on Oden. So first off is sediment coring and processing. I think this might have been the largest operation in terms of people, both science and crew. Coring was done from the stern deck. You can see here, cores were loaded, core rigs were loaded onto the A-frame. And there were different types of coring systems. We had gravity cores, there's 2 of them here, a 9-meter long piston core, and it holds over 1,000 kilograms of weight on it. And then there was a multi-core package, and this was a system that we very lightly lowered to the sea floor, and then we fired it so that all 10 or 12 of these cores entered the sea floor at the same time. Like I said, a lot of people, a lot of expertise required to core in ice conditions. We see here Matt and Marcus prepping a piston core, the piston core being raised on the A-frame, and then the A-frame holding the piston core up as, I believe, as it moves out to move the core away from the ship. And you can see a lot of ice floating all around. Once the cores came back on board, they required a number of people to sort of get them out of the rigs and into the labs for processing. This is Emily, she's a student at Stockholm University, and she's pulling off one of the multi-core samples for processing. There were, I believe, 24 core sites, and at each site we often took multiple cores and different types of cores. So there was a huge amount of data, and you can't leave the cores on the deck. Of course, you need to process them, I think, pretty much immediately after recovery. Matt O'Regan ran the coring operations. Here he is slicing a piston core. Brendan from OSU is sampling a gravity or a piston core for analysis. A lot of the analysis happens on land, so you can see, you know, we kept all of the cores, of course, and there's baggies of material, but a lot of that analysis happened on Oden as well. So this is Laura Gemery and Tom Cronin of USGS, and they did a ton of analysis. This is a ongoing experiment, or I mean, in this picture, it's an ongoing experiment looking at oxygen in the upper sediment column. And these were the kind of things that got started immediately after the core was taken. And as you can imagine, there are a ton of sort of preliminary results. This is just one example. We have some down core photos of a series of gravity cores from the Lincoln Sea, as well as core profiles. And somebody, I'm not sure who, Matt perhaps or Tom, drew this line connecting the cores sort of spatially across the Lincoln Sea and connecting this interface, identifying where this upper level of sediment was deposited. We also collected a ton of oceanography data. This was a major work package. This is the CTD rosette, which was deployed from the bow from a different A-frame, but an A-frame. Near the bottom is the CTD package, which collects profiles of conductivity, temperature, depth, gives it its name, as well as some other parameters. There also are the Niskin bottles. These are for water sampling in the water column. And these yellow packages on here are acoustic packages. There was also a UVP high resolution photo system. And so the CTD had an interesting procedure for its deployment because of the acoustics. So on the downcast, the side-facing high-frequency acoustic system and the UVP would collect data, and then they timed it so that when the CTD started its upcast and it started collecting its bottle data, the lower frequency downward-facing profiler would collect data. And just like with the coring, the deployment and the recovery and the sampling of this data requires a ton of people, and it felt like they were working around the clock to make that happen. They collected 28 data at 28 oceanographic stations in Sherard Osborn Fjord alone. And we have here just some preliminary results. These are data from the Niskin bottles. This is, depth and pressure, and looking at, DIC, PCO2, aragonite saturation rates. This is an interesting figure. So this is depth. This is deep in the water column, looking at potential temperature from different places. So the cyan is the inner part of Sherard Osborn Fjord near to Ryder Ice Tongue. The black is from the mouth of Ryder Fjord. And then the blue and the red are from Petermann in different years. And we can see immediately there's significantly colder water near to the ice tongue. And I'll return to that in a bit, well, actually near the end. And finally, there were those co-located profiles from the acoustic and the CTD system. So this is turbidity as a function of depth, and turbidity is a measure of particulates or plankton in the water. And we see this general increase, but also these peaks in sort of the midwater. And we see those peaks in the acoustic system as well, and a single peak in the UVP from the photo data. So these data, I think, are going to be used for some sort of acoustical oceanography, looking at bioacoustics. Speaking of biology, we did directly sample the biological community with different nets. We had the multi-nets, the plankton net. They were deployed from a variety of locations. And these provide direct information about the plankton communities in the fjords. And there were 15 net sites. And there obviously was some processing with the microscope. I think a lot of these samples were preserved in formaldehyde for post-cruise processing. In addition to those equipment deployed from Oden, there are several systems that are mounted on Oden and collect data continuously. One of these is the atmospheric greenhouse concentration data set, which is continually measured with a series of spectrometers from both the bowsprit and the meteorological mast. And that's about 20 meters above sea level. And they're on the bow because Oden, the ship exhaust has carbon dioxide and other hydrocarbons in it. And here are some of their preliminary data sets. We have spatial distributions of both carbon dioxide and methane in Sherard Osborn Fjord, and we can see maybe an emission, a peak in methane emission here, potentially a sink of carbon dioxide here. Seawater was also, surface seawater was also sampled continuously from an intake valve. Adam is here in the water chemistry lab, and that seawater was measured for concentrations of a variety of things: temperature, salinity, methane, carbon dioxide. And some of the sort of interesting preliminary data we see here is temperature plotted over the full survey area. So this is Sherard Osborn Fjord, this is Petermann Fjord, and we can see sea surface temperatures are pretty low for the majority of our activities, around 0 degrees. But you enter into Sherard Osborn Fjord and the temperatures are in excess of 4 degrees, which is very, very high for the Arctic, even in the summer. So a very interesting data set there. And then, last but obviously not least is the acoustic systems that are mounted on Oden's hull. And these were ran 24 hours a day. It's part of the geophysical mapping group. Our fearless leader was Dr. Calder. We collected bathymetric data with the multi-beam swath sonar system. This is EM122, it's 12 kilohertz. It also collects water column data, you can see in this triangle. We also have a mid-water sonar. This is a EK60, ES18 combo, a lot narrower beam. You can see here in the image, but that collects information of phenomenon between the sea surface and the sea floor for the most part. And then of course we have a sub-bottom profiler, which collects subsurface information up to 200 meters below the sea floor. And like previous expeditions, we upgraded our EK60 to an EK80. So this involved carrying this transceiver unit, this black thing right here, down to the in-between or the tween decks below the gym and installing it in this rack. So we unplugged the EK60 and we plugged in the EK80, and that gave us broadband capabilities. So we were able to collect data between 15 and 30 kilohertz instead of just at 18 kilohertz. And as you can imagine, 3 different acoustic systems pinging 24 hours a day. This required a very large team. We monitored the data and we processed it. And as I said, Brian led us. This is Martin Jakobsen and Larry. They were our co-chief scientists. And then we had Stockholm University students and researchers and some somewhat questionable CCOM people as well. And this is an overview of our expedition sort of location. This is the bathymetric data collected in Petermann during the Petermann expedition. This is Sherard Osborn Fjord and Ryder Glacier sort of down there. And I can overlay the bathymetry that we collected and processed during the Ryder expedition. So our objective was really the complete mapping of Sherard Osborn Fjord, but you can see that we collected data and we processed the bathymetry during, all of our operations in a number of different locations. Robson's Channel, Lincoln Sea, Nares Strait, and some additional information in Petermann. A total of almost 2,500 nautical miles of data, which is equivalent to about 5,000 square kilometers of area, and only 900 of those 2,500 nautical miles were transit data. So even though we transited for 3 days there and back, I'm actually sure it took us 3 days to get back, we still collected a huge amount of data. So taking a closer look at some of the bathymetric data sets. So on the left here, you can see Sherard Osborn Fjord. First thing is we discovered it has 2 sills, not just the one. So there's an outer sill. It's rugged. There's a lot of jointed bedrock here, and it's 457 meters deep. And then on the inside of the fjord is this much smoother, shallower inner sill, 390 meters deep. In between, there's a trough, a basal trough, and there's a number of interesting topographic features there as well. They show sort of the classic glacial crag and tail structures where you can tell the direction of the ice flow. It's pushed material behind these bathymetric highs. There are many glacial lineations on the features, mostly the inner sill and the trough, but also the outer sill, and that tells you sort of the direction of ice flow. And you'll also note maybe that there are a few holes in the data set here and here especially, and those are actually locations of giant icebergs, huge icebergs, pieces of the ice tongue that had broken off, and sometimes we just could not get around them. The other bathymetric data set I wanted to draw your attention to is that one in Lincoln Sea. So this was from when we were collecting data in heavy ice conditions. It looked something like this. So it was very challenging both for, the operator of Oden, the captain, or whomever was driving Oden, but also the mapping team. We had to work very hard to remove a lot of artifacts. But if we zoom in to this particular area, you can see really nice looking bathymetry and really interesting bathymetry. On all of this bedrock, or especially this section of bedrock and this section of bedrock, we have glacial lineations superimposed upon it. And if we sort of take the trend direction of both of these sets of lineations, we can extrapolate that we have 2 ice streams here, and they might converge out here farther out in the Lincoln Sea where we couldn't get to. And they correspond, we think, to Ryder Glacier from Sherard Osborn Fjord, but also the glacier from Victoria Fjord, which is interesting. We didn't know anything about convergence during the last glacial expansion, so this could be something that we might want to explore in the future if we could ever come back here. Now, the acoustic systems, they were collecting, all of this amazing bathymetry, but they were also simultaneously collecting water column data. And the water column data was collected at the acoustic mapping station with the bathymetry. So, for example, Julia Mikowski is working here processing some bathymetric data, but she's also working with a team monitoring the split beam data, the sub-bottom data, and then actually the bathy data is just out of the photo over here. And during the cruise, we observed lots of interesting things in the water column. Anyone who knows me knows that this is the kind of stuff that I do, so I'm particularly interested in water column phenomenon. In Sherard Osborn Fjord and in Hall Basin, which is near to Petermann Fjord, we saw gas bubbles in the water column. So these are, streams of gas escaping from the seafloor. They look like these vertical features in the water column, and we saw them in a couple of places. We also saw thermal haline staircases in the Lincoln Sea, and they they're named for their staircase-like appearance in temperature and salinity profiles. So we have here temperature and salinity both increasing in this very particular fashion with depth. And acoustically, they appear as these thin like layers that extend for long distances, often a few kilometers here. And so we're steaming here, and you see these lines, and this is actually us breaking ice. So we sort of lose track of them a little bit, but they appear on the other side over here. And we also saw animals in the water column data and observed some behavior. So this is the data set from a station. So Oden was sitting still while a CTD was being deployed here. So you can see the CTD track going down. This is the rosette going down to the bottom, collecting its data, and then eventually it goes back up. And this is the deep scattering layer. So this is, 200, 450 meters. It's made up of fish. And the reason that I know it's fish is that before the CTD comes down, you see them here. And as soon as the CTD passes over them, you see this reduction in scattering. So this is all the fish, I think, swimming away from the CTD. So amazing acoustic data sets. However, Oden is a very large ship, and as a mapping platform, it can't enter into some areas. So we had two other more mobile mapping platforms. One of them was RV Skidbladner, which you can see here in this image. This is a 6.5 meter research vessel. She lives in this little cradle on Oden's port side, and she's deployed obviously with the crane. She's got a bow-mounted high frequency multi-beam, higher than Oden's, between 200 and 400 kilohertz, which gives you very high resolution data, but significantly reduces your depth range. So this is for shallow water work. In addition to the multi-beam, we pulled behind us this little fiberglass towfish, and that carried a sub-bottom profiler and two broadband split beam transducers, the ES-120 and the 200. And I was lucky enough to be part of the Skidbladner deployments. So we deploy Skidbladner mainly at some outlet glaciers in Petermann Fjord. So this is a photo I took. So this is, Greenland, and you see the glacier coming down and terminating in the marine environment. So this marine terminating glacier, the glacier face is in the water. And the deployments were amazing, but very crowded. You can see this photo I took. This is me and Martin and Lars. And I can tell you that 3 people do not fit into the cabin very easily. The other thing was that we had to wear these immersion suits for safety because it's very cold. You fall in the water and you don't want to get wet, but they really only fit 6-foot tall Nordic men. They don't fit me. So this is probably like 4 sizes too big for me. I was drowning in this immersion suit, but it's totally worth it because we collected some really amazing data. So we drove as close as we dared to this outlet glacier. This is the acoustic data that we collected. So the ship is up here sort of driving into the screen, and you can actually see the submerged face of the glacier in the acoustic data. So this is, a continuation of this glacier going into the water, and this is the seafloor, and we actually saw these evolving vertical plumes along the face of the glacier, which is just very exciting. Of course, we collected bathymetry. You can see it here, very shallow. The face of the glacier is up here at the top, very shallow, and then drops very rapidly away from the glacier face. And we saw a number of gas seeps in the water column as well, which was pretty cool. The other mobile platform was the EcoBoat ASV, the autonomous surface vessel. You see it right here. So it's 1.7 meters long, it's yellow. It's equipped with a Pico multi-beam, which is 120 kilohertz, has integrated positioning and motion sensing. And it was run by Sam Reed-Weidner and Kevin Jerem. They're both, affiliated with CCOM. Sam is a recent graduate and Kevin's a research scientist. They both spent a little bit of time with the ASV before the cruise. They did deploy it from Oden. You can see here it was deployed with one of the cranes, and it's zipping around Oden early in the cruise. But they primarily actually supported the land teams, if you can believe it. And you can see Kevin here, and I think also Larry and Matt in the helicopter getting ready to head back to Oden or just landing on land, which is a nice segue into the land operations. So the land operations took place pretty much continuously during the expedition. There was occasional weather, fog, snow, and high winds, and those prevented the deployment of the land teams because the helicopters couldn't fly. So Oden has 2 helicopters, one of them taking off right here, the other one sitting on the helipad. The helicopters used to obviously transport people, but also equipment. I've heard, I didn't get to fly in the helicopters, but I've heard that 5 people can fit uncomfortably in the helicopters. including the pilot. They also can put gear in the helicopters, but often the gear was transported by these cargo slings. There was a number of sites, mostly day sites, but you'll notice a couple of camp sites, and there was a group that would stay on land for a number of days to do their science. So there was a glaciology team, was run by Abe and Felicity. These are graduate students from SU, and they were collecting data sets of calving events at the glacial front. So they set up this very high resolution time-lapse camera on the, I think, the eastern wall of the fjord, looking out at the front, and they could zoom way in on this. And they also placed a hydrophone actually on the glacier. So this is the hydrophone is in the water, but the line was on top of the glacier. And they did observe calving events and also collect hydrophone data to go with that. And here's an example of that. So here we have the glacial front, and you'll notice that this piece looks quite different in the next frame, and there is a splash, right? And then that splash moves outward. So that's a small calving event, not a massive one that releases a huge iceberg. There was a number of teams that collected data, on land. One of them was the driftwood team, or the deadwood team, and you can see all of their sampling locations, number of samples that they collected. So they flew in the helicopters and they trekked all over the beach looking for driftwood. And in the photos, you'll notice, of course, that Northern Greenland doesn't have trees. And it turns out that driftwood actually indicates the presence of sea ice, because wood in an ice-free ocean will get waterlogged and it will sink before it really drifts very far or for very long. So they were looking for these driftwood samples to understand information about ocean currents, but also using the tree rings, to get ages, using carbon-14 dating to get ages and understand something about ocean currents and sea ice cover. So you can see some twigs they collected, but also these tree ring cores. There was an archaeology, paleogenetics, and ecology team, and they were working to understand the post-glacial colonization of Greenland. So this is colonization not only of people, obviously people, but also just mammals and vascular plants. There are two, I think, known post-glacial groups of people on Greenland. The Independence people dated to 4,000 years before present, and the Thule people dated to 800 years before present. And they spent time on land searching areas that were likely to attract a human presence, lakes and riverbeds, but they also visited some sites, known archaeological sites, with the aim to basically collect some information to retrieve more exact timing, chronology. And they found some really cool artifacts. So on the right here is a shallow bowl they believe was used to process grains. So you'd put grains into the bowl and you get a rock and you would sort of move the grains and break them down. And on the left is this skin scraper used to prepare hides, which has a really cool story Brian wanted me to share. So Louvet, the researcher who found it, first off, it's broken into multiple pieces. I'm not sure if you can tell, but there's a crack here. And so he was on land and he picked it up, and it was covered in mud. And he didn't pick it up because he thought that it was an artifact. He just happened to think it was a piece of flint or several pieces of flint. When he got back to Oden, his roommate sort of convinced him that they should wash it off. And as they washed it off, they realized that the pieces he picked up fit together. And he called it the world's most surreal jigsaw puzzle. And Brian got the chance to hold it and to sort of examine it. And he told me that he used it to see if he could take the hair off of his arm, because it's quite sharp down here. And he told me that it works just as well as any razor now. And this is from 4,000 years ago. So that was just a really cool story. Everyone wanted to see the skin scraper when the story got around the ship. And some of the sites visited by this team were these very small, shallow lakes. Lakes are a source of water, obviously, but they also are a catchment basin. So they collect and they preserve information about ancient ecosystems. So they took a number of cores, the lake teams, and they're going to use them to sample for radiocarbon dating from, I assume, plant remains, and analyze them for various physical and chemical properties, as well as genomic sequencing. They're actually they're gonna sequence any DNA they find in here to try to understand who's living around these lakes. And they had some assistance. So they had assistance from the ASV team, who basically supplemented their work with these really cool bathymetric maps of the lakes. So Sam and Kevin would prep the ASV every night, and they were being deployed, and they would go out and they would survey the lakes. And this was a learning experience. It turns out if the ASV gets really cold, it does not turn on. So they had this, they heated it up with a heat gun at one point in time, but they came up with a procedure, and then they were able to obviously create some really cool maps. These are really shallow lakes. The deepest here, the deepest depth is not even 10 meters. So, and I think they even ran some autonomy protocols when they were collecting the data, which is cool. And then there, of course, was the sub-bottom profiling. And this was collected by our co-chief scientists, Martin and Larry. They would occasionally leave Oden, and they would row this little inflatable boat around and drag the fiberglass towboat with the sub-bottom profiler. And I've heard, I didn't get to go to land, but I heard they were really a sight to be seen rowing across the lake. But they collected, I mean, look, the sub-bottom profiles are just amazing. This laminated sediments, very, very fine layers, really cool data sets. And finally, there was the land team run by Dr. Alan Mix from OSU. This is his grad student, Anne, and his postdoc, Brendan, and they were studying sea level history, and they were documenting and dating former sea level high stands on the land, surrounding Sherard Osborn Fjord and Petermann Fjord and sort of the general vicinity. And they were doing this by finding identifiable, datable sources within sort of the geological layers. So this mostly meant marine shells or driftwood or plants or bones. And they would look at sites that had been uplifted by isostatic rebound. And isostatic rebound sort of basically it refers to the rising of land that follows glacial retreat. So the weight of ice from a glacier is so much that it actually depresses the land. And so when that weight goes away because the glacier has retreated, the land rises up, isostatic rebound. And so they were looking for these sites. They mostly found clams, I think. So they found big clams, and they found tiny clams and medium-sized clams. And by accurately positioning them and dating them, they can define the marine limit, which is the highest level of inundation by seawater since the last glacial maximum. And they worked at a bunch of different locations. This is Sherard Osborn Fjord, Victoria Fjord, Petermann Fjord. So they were all over the place. And the one that I wanted to highlight was the Hall Land West site, or the Hall Basin. So they were working here. It was a very shallow basin. So they had all of this help. So it was a really cool day of multidisciplinary science. So Alan's team was looking for clams on shore. The ASV team was there assisting. It was very shallow. The deepest sounding out like over half a kilometer was only 2 meters deep. So the ASV was out there going back and forth, dodging icebergs. At one point in time, I think they had to pull it in with they had a problem with one of the rudders. But also Skid Blodner was out there mapping with the multibeam beyond, where the ASV was mapping deeper, I think, than 5 meters. And then Oden also has I haven't mentioned this, but Oden has a workboat called Moonin, and Moonin was dragging the tow body, and we were collecting broadband data. So there were 3 acoustic mapping systems mapping at the same time. So a bunch of different groups. And then I don't know whose idea it was, and maybe Larry probably knows and could chime in here. But they decided that they could collect clam samples with the grab sampler using the helicopter. So they basically connected this grab sampler to the helicopter. They had Sven, the pilot, take it out there, and then he would drop it really rapidly and collect. You can tell he's got sample here, and they'd bring it back to land, and they would go through some processing. They were looking for clams in the very shallow basin. So it was just a really cool day of like multidisciplinary science, and it was crazy because they were sampling with the helicopter, and they actually attracted the attention of a local charismatic megafauna. They saw polar bear tracks when they arrived. You see, this is Anna's hand here in a polar bear track, and it turns out that the polar bear was interested in the clam grabbing as well. You can see it right there, which was very exciting, of course, at first for the land team, but then you realize you're on the same piece of land with the polar bear, so less exciting, I think. Turns out the polar bear, there was no interaction between the land team and the polar bear. And for the rest of us on the ships that didn't get to see the polar bear, we did see other polar bears. So the polar bears hung out on the ice as well. This one was particularly charismatic, photogenic polar bear who was rearing up and jumping between icebergs and scratching his or her head with his feet. So that was fun. Wolves do not go out on the ice. So the land team saw a lot of wolves, even some pups and some prints as well. They took a lot of photos. They had some close encounters as well. So this is the helicopter, and you can see a wolf right there. No one was hurt, no wolves were hurt or anything like that, but they did apparently get quite close. And then they also saw some bison from the helicopters, bison tracks, and even seals. These are seals swimming on top of Ryder Glacier in the Glacier Meltwater River, which was just crazy. And then for those of us who were in the small boats, there was a interaction with some charismatic megafauna in the form of narwhals. And I'm gonna play this video, and I apologize in advance. I know the FPS for Zoom is pretty low, so I'm not sure how much you're gonna see, but this is a pod of 4 narwhals coming close to us on the small boat work at the outlet glaciers. And there's no sound because I was screaming like a little girl, and it's really embarrassing, and I don't want everyone to hear that. So they came close. I don't know if you saw their horns there, or they're actually tooths, but they came quite close to us, and that was probably like a top 5 moment in my life. So we entered and mapped Sherard Osborn Fjord. We saw narwhals, we did science. What did we learn? I mean, we learned a lot because there were 14 work packages, but let's return to those sort of driving research questions. So, I mean, we wanted to understand the history of the Greenland ice sheet and the processes that are causing the rapid acceleration of mapping. And we're particularly interested in the part that the floating ice shelves played, especially at Ryder Glacier, because it's expanding, right? It's not retreating like Petermann or other floating ice tongues. So what did we find? Well, we found, first off, Sherard Osborn Fjord has 2 sills. So this is the Ryder Glacier ice tongue at one end, and then this is the mouth of the fjord. And we've taken this profile down the middle, and that's what you're seeing here. So there's an outer sill, it's pretty rough, and you have an inner sill that's much smoother, but it's also much shallower, right? And this is very different geomorphology than what we've seen at other locations, including Petermann Fjord, which is a place where you have rapid loss of the ice tongue. So again, you know, this is the Petermann ice tongue and the mouth of Petermann Fjord and a profile down the middle. And, you know, what we see is that first off, Petermann has a single sill, and it doesn't have the same prominence as the inner sill of Sherard Osborn Fjord, and it's shallower as well. I mean, it's deeper as well. Sherard Osborn Fjord's inner sill is quite shallow. And we also have seen this piece of data before. So these are the depth profiles of potential temperature at different locations. So the cyan one is from the inner part of Sherard Osborn Fjord. So it's near to the ice tongue, it's inside this inner sill. The black is from the mouth, and then the 2 red and blue ones are from Petermann. So we can see immediately that the deep water near to the Ryder ice tongue is quite a bit colder. And this is a figure that shows those trends even more clearly, I think. So again, we have depth here, and then we have distance from the ice tongue. So this is the ice tongue. This is, you know, the mouth of the fjord, both for Sherard Osborn Fjord and for Petermann, colored by potential temperature. So what we see in both cases is that there is warm water, and it's of Atlantic origin in both fjords. In Petermann Fjord, the sill here does not prevent that water from entering the fjord and making its way all the way to as far inward as we could map. But at Ryder, while there is this warm water in the fjord, the inner sill appears to block that water from interacting with the ice tongue. And that maybe is a good part of the reason why temperatures are so much colder here. So we might conclude very generally that the inner sill that we see here of Sherard Osborn Fjord is preventing this sort of warm Atlantic water from interacting with the Ryder ice sheet. And perhaps that's why it's allowing for its continued expansion. And if you're interested in you know, this conclusion or conclusions from Petermann and why Petermann is retreating, there are a number of very well written publications about Petermann that are available, and there's one that's soon to be available for Sherard Osborn Fjord. It's working its way through peer review or and I can point those towards you. But for now, I think I will just leave you with this thoughts, and Larry and Brian and I will take your questions.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, so we'll open it up to questions. You can either raise your hand, as we've done in the past weeks, or also enter in the chat box. Jack, go ahead.
So I have two questions. I wanted to start with one and then let someone else jump in, but could you go back to that very recent slide showing the sills and the water temperature profiles, or the
This one?
yeah. So I'm just curious, in Petermann, it looks like the sill intersects with that, the into the 0.3 to 0.4 gradient, but there's a sill that's high enough to be blocking that. I mean, that sill looks to go higher into that water column profile than the one at Sherard Osborn. Are there gaps in those sills that are letting the warm water through? I mean, if you think of the sill as like a dam, it looks like the Petermann Dam are higher than that 0.3 to 0.4 line than on the left. I was just curious if thinking of them as a dam is not right, and at different points in the cross section of the fjord, maybe the sills are lower.
Yeah, so I mean, I could try to answer. Larry or Brian could also chime in. But this figure in particular shows part of a cross section, and then the dotted line is the maximum extent of the sill, sort of in that cross section in this direction that we're looking. So
right.
part of Petermann sill is in fact higher, and part is as high as you're seeing here, but parts of it are also shallow. And I think there's a channel in Petermann along the Petermann sill, but Larry maybe can answer that one. I haven't been there actually.
Right. Well, that dotted line for Sherard Osborn does go much higher, so that explains it. I think I wasn't clear what the dotted lines were.
Yes, I'm sorry. So the dotted lines are the maximum extent at some points along the sill.
And I was going to wait and come back, but as I still got the floor, I guess my other question was for the land studies. I was really impressed by how seemingly thick the sediment deposits were in those little tiny lakes that Larry and was part of profiling. Is that all in like the last 8,000 or 10,000 years, or was that land not ever covered by ice?
No, it was definitely covered by ice, and that is. It's just some amazing sedimentation rates there, often caused by catastrophic failures that will basically pile a huge lump of sediment into the lake. So I think.
But it looked like it was pretty well stratified, though.
Yeah, it does, and I think it's just generally a very high sedimentation rate. But I think it's all very, very young, very recent.
Looks like we have a question from Sally for Liz. Did you have a particular focus for your own research during this expedition, or were you doing multidisciplinary research?
Oh, thanks, Sally. I was one of the co-PIs for the water column data collection, but I also worked very closely with Brian on the geophysical mapping. So I think day to day, I was focused on data collection, just collecting the best data as possible. My particular interest is in those marine terminating glaciers, where we collected the data on the small boats as close as we could get to them. So those are data sets that I'm interested in. But I think during the cruise, it was mostly focused on getting the best data for everybody, as possible.
Great. I'll give everyone one more second here for any last minute questions. It looks like we have another one. What was the deepest depth you surveyed, and what other interesting features did you find that maybe surprised you or amazed you?
Brian, do you remember what the deepest depth was?
Yeah, it's a little over 1,000 meters in the deepest part of the fjord, and that piece between the two sills there, where it goes real flat. That's about as deep as we saw it down there. I think what doesn't come through in the, I mean, although the pictures are beautiful there, what doesn't quite come through is just how detailed that bathymetry is. It is spectacular down there. And if you get a chance, we have fledermaus scenes for the whole lot. You can go and look at them. It's just beautiful. And even on the back of that inner sill there, you can see there's all sort of striations and marks in the back where the ice has edged up and dropped off and edged up and dropped off. It really is beautiful there, just so detailed, much more so than many other bathymetries that I've seen.
Yeah, I would say it was pretty cool to be able to see the plumes moving up the glacier, the marine terminating glacier face, going back to the small boat work. That wasn't something we were expecting to see. We know that there are plumes that move along, freshwater plumes that move along the face of marine terminating glaciers, but to see them in the acoustics was very surprising. And Martin and I were on that small boat, you know, like tapping the screen going, are you seeing this? We're seeing these plumes. So that was really exciting for me from like a personal research perspective.
I think the other thing that Liz mentioned is just how big the place is. And it's hard to, even from the pictures, it's hard to tell how big this is. From the bridge of the Oden, which is like 6 flights up, you could see the glacier face, and it looks like the side glaciers. You could see them, and they look kind of small-ish. And then you realize that the little black dot that you can barely see with the naked eye is a 6 meter long launch right next to the glacier face, actually doing the mapping. And those cliffs that look kind of okay are actually about, 3,000 feet high, about 1,000 meters high. They look close enough to touch. It's a remarkable place. And that happens underneath you could be right up against, what you think is as close to the side walls of the fjord as you think you're going to ever get, and you're wondering why the captain is crazy enough to take you there. And it will still be about 300 meters deep underneath the ship. It's a remarkable place to map.
Yeah, as Brian said, you'd feel often that you could touch the wall of the fjord, but when we actually looked on the chart, he had a rule. He would never come closer than a couple of kilometers to the wall. And so we were still a couple of kilometers away, but it just felt so close. Mm. So I'm going to give a very strange answer to what was the greatest surprise to me. And it wasn't a scientific one, it was a more social scientific one. And that was the abundance of archaeological sites. To think that people inhabited an area like that 4,000 years ago is just remarkable. We were there in what was probably the best weather window in a relatively warm summer, and it is not very pleasant. It's quite cold, but to imagine folks 4,000 years ago living through season after season, it is just absolutely amazing to me.
Looks like
I always had one last question, and I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this, but did like Icebridge or anybody ever do ice penetrating radar? And what is the Ryder Glacier grounding on now? Is it another sill further upstream, or do we know anything about the shape of the bed under the floating ice shelf or under the actual glacier?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's one of our big challenges, Jack. Is we'd love to see much further up. We actually could look a kilometer or so to under the floating ice shelf with the multi-beam. We do. We have some idea. We think it's grounded on another sill, and there has been some ice bridge work there, but it's pretty ambiguous. And so in Peterman, we had the advantage of actually being able to have a series of drill sites. Basque did 3 drill sites on the floating ice, so we actually can get water profiles, and we knew that the warm waters were moving all the way up to the grounding line. But right. We don't know what's going on there easily. Again, there is a little ice bridge stuff, but it's pretty low resolution. We had ice bridge stuff at Peterman, and when we actually got the bathymetry, it's not the most accurate, but it does give you some sense. And we do think, and if I'm trying to remember how far up, it was about 20 kilometers further up was the grounding line, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the technology, but doing GPR or ice penetrating radar to get to the bed might be possible from a helicopter or something if you ever got back there, or if anybody else does. And I think that Liz, at the beginning, she should count on getting back there, right? 10 or 15 years, you won't even need an icebreaker. You just, go up there and
Beam right up, unfortunately, maybe. Yeah.
So I saw a question there from Sally again. She says, she asks about whether the vessel technicians were doing the mapping or whether the researchers were doing the mapping. This is actually brings up a really interesting point about mapping with Oden. I think working with the crew on Oden has to be one of the most pleasurable seagoing experiences I've ever had in 20 years of doing it. We were out in the Lincoln Sea waiting for something to happen. I forget what it was, a gravity station or something. And I was sitting at the mapping station, which is about, I don't know, 5 meters behind where the conning station is for the ship. It's all on the bridge. And the mate in charge walked over and he said, "Can we go start mapping now?" I've never been on a ship where the crew wanted to go start mapping, and they're so well trained that you don't even have to give them sort of waypoints or anything else like you do for many other big ships. You just say, "Map over there," and they'll go over there and map. And they know how to arrange the multi-beam so that they'll do overlap and they won't leave gaps in. And they're very proud of their ability to do it as well. They are quite extraordinary, the way that they do that sort of thing. That being said, the researchers did, and the students, graduate students predominantly, stood watches with all the mapping stations and collected all the data and processed all the data. And my job was to tell them where they got it wrong, for the most part, and try to fix the problems with the data, particularly for refraction, which, as you might imagine, in an area where you have freshwater melt on top of salt water is extraordinarily difficult. And I have to give a lot of credit to Kevin Jerem, who mastered the tools in Chimera to help with that and did a spectacular job of cleaning things up when we messed it up. So it was a very interesting, very, very interesting place to go map.
Sounds like such an amazing learning experience.
But also the bottom line on the Oden is that without a scientific party, they are not capable of operating the multibeam. It really depends on the scientific party to come and be the operators, not only of the multibeam, but almost of everything. The coring is done by the scientific. It's quite a different model than we have, particularly in NOAA. It's really the scientists that will operate everything but the winches, really. And somebody asked the question, I guess Liz, who had that crazy idea to take cores from the helicopter? Not only the clam cores, we actually tried to take in the lakes, believe it or not, giant piston or gravity cores. And the answer was that it was one of the project managers, really from the Swedish Polar Secretariat, Ulf Feldman. Again, as Brian said, it's just such an amazing different experience. It's the crew and the support staff that are challenging the scientists to go further and push further. And it's an experience I've never had on another ship. Usually it's a battle for the scientists pushing the crew to extend the capability. But here they're pushing the scientists all the time.
So tell the truth, Larry. Tell me where the answer really, the idea really came from, or what fueled the idea.
I'm not going to say. I'm on mute.
So I think we have time for one more question. Jack, do you have another question, it looks like? Or actually, we have Stephen. Do you have a question?
Hi, thank you for this amazing presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more possibly about the autonomy protocols you mentioned for the ASV, or if there's somewhere I could go to learn a little bit more about what they used in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think the autonomy protocols, I don't think I can speak to them. I don't think I can speak to them personally. I'm not sure if Larry or Brian can, but I happen to know the guy who does.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what you're asking in terms of autonomy protocols. We can tell you we had a very, very small, low power multi-beam on a very small vehicle, and we were just kind of flying by the seat of our pants in terms of how to use it. Do you have a specific question about?
Yeah, so I guess as I'm learning more about the the Ben ASV that we have here. And one of the modes that it ships with is basically you give it a waypoint, and it has a PID controller, and it goes, and then you give it the next waypoint. And then obviously there's a spectrum beyond that of different kinds of algorithms for coverage for planning and motion planning. So sort of wondering where it fell in that spectrum.
Yeah, so I could tell you that there were two ways to drive this thing. One was with the joystick directly, and the other was laying down waypoints. But that's really it. This is a whole different level of autonomy. This is really a very small scale effort. Nothing like Ben in terms of the autonomy issues that we try to address there.
It looks like Sam just commented, who was the one who does that. He said just waypoint navigation. So that was what they were doing with
the point of having the system on board was as essentially I guess as a technology demonstrator, is to say, look, can we use these systems in this sort of mapping mode where there are areas where we can't get to and which we'd like to get more information on, and maybe it's not safe enough to send a small boat there, like right up against the glacier face, for example, although we did. So that was really what it was about, is, can we take these systems into that sort of environment? Can they work in that environment? And we learned a lot of lessons about that, particularly that you don't get them cold. Or once they get started, they're fine. But if they're cold before they start, they don't start, as it turns out. So that's really what we were doing there, and getting all the data as well was just icing on the cake, really.
Right, and I think the mode of using it was really never to have it out of sight. So we could always fall back to literally a hand-driven situation if we had to, but certainly you can do a much better survey, and I think the lake surveys benefited tremendously by being able to lay out waypoints and having it run the waypoints automatically. You get smoother offsets and things like that.
Sounds like a huge success. Thank you.
They had an issue with the antenna as well on the hand navigator, right? It didn't go quite as far.
Yeah, there were lots of issues, as with everything. I mean, we present all the nice results here, but getting to those results, tremendous credit to Sam and to Kevin to working through lots of issues for a system that we had really never seen, it worked out, I think, very nicely.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for this week. So thank you for all your questions, and thanks to the speakers once again, and we will see you next week.
And thank you, Alyssa and Annie, for your...
Yes, I wanted to chime in and thank Annie and Alyssa for going above and beyond, serving more than just their year term, but a year and a half almost. So we really do appreciate it, and they finally have passed the mantle over, and so we'll hopefully continue on with a good series of seminars. But I do thank you.
You're welcome, of course. Have a great weekend, everyone.